We're live.
Happy days. Greetings, everyone. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes before we proceed, just in case there are a couple still trying to join. But like I said, thanks so much for joining. Great to have you all here on a Wednesday as we are fast approach the Christmas holidays. Just give it another minute or so. As you can see, number of people filing in. So for those that are here, we'll share this again when we start the presentation. But there's a little chat function that you'll be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to click that and pop any questions you might have as we go. We've got Elizabeth and Bruce saying good day. Hello, both. Great to have you. Perfect. All right, so 2 past midday Brisbane time, where Stuart and I are coming from. We'll kick things off now for today's webinar on what changes are happening in the NDIS currently. As we're probably all aware, there have been a few, and it can be sometimes a little bit difficult to navigate what those changes mean to us practically. And so we at Clickability want to try and demystify some of that for you today. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We will email these slides to our registrants after the webinar finishes. But this webinar will also be going live, so you can rewatch it if you wish. As I've mentioned, there is a chat functionality for you to pop any questions you might have as we go through, and we'll endeavour to get to them either as we go or at the very end of today's webinar. But as to who we are and why we do it, it's worth a small introduction. My name's Tristram. I've been with Clickability for a long time, coming up on 10 years now. I am, as well as being head of participant engagement at Clickability, also an NDIS participant myself. So I've got lived experience about what it means to navigate the NDIS, and have gone through the entire process of plan assessments and so on and so forth. So hopefully I can lend a little bit of my expertise to you all. When I'm not at work and being a participant, you'll find me playing power chair football, which is an exciting mix of futsal and go-karting. Highly recommend you look it up. But that's where you'll find me if I'm not at work. Stuart, do you want to share a little bit about yourself and your role at Clickability?
Yes, so I'm Stuart. I'm head of growth, and effectively I sort of help build the platform and bring a lot of people to it. So also in charge of a lot of the marketing. And yeah, my background is I'm up in Brisbane, and yeah, I've been working for Clickability for 2 years now, and yeah, love every moment of it and love to give back and help people find their perfect provider.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Stuart. That's a little bit about us. We would love to know a little bit about you. We've got a poll which Stuart will start now. You can access it on the right-hand side of your screen under the polls tab. We'd love to know a little bit about where you are in your NDIS journey. So that will obviously help us share the right information for you where you are in that journey. And we can, we'll cater our messaging today to that particular point. So feel free to jump into that poll and pop your answers in, whether you're new to the NDIS waiting for approval or you're a long-term participant. To the webinar itself and the changes that we have been seeing rolled out throughout the disability sector in the last 12 months. And it's probably necessary to provide a little bit of context as to why these changes are taking place. So to do that, we're going to take a very quick look at the NDIS review, which has been going on for probably the last 2 years or so. But what prompted it? So the NDIS review came about in October 2022, after there was a lot of chat amongst the media around the sustainability of the scheme. We are all probably privy to the conversations that have been swirling around. It can be quite distressing hearing those conversations happen. We're all in the scheme for the right reasons, but a lot of this media attention prompted Bill Shorten to announce this review. The review itself was co-chaired by Professor Bruce Monaghan, who was integral in getting the scheme up and running all those years ago, as well as Ms. Lisa Paul. And the review's goals were broadly two things: to evaluate the design, operations, and sustainability of the NDIS, and also to build a more responsive, supportive, and sustainable market and workforce. So we've highlighted those two words there, sustainability and sustainable, because it was what prompted the review in the first place, this meaty conversation around it. And from that media conversation and the review being announced, we then had the final report handed down at the end of 2023. So the working together to deliver the NDIS report made 26 recommendations with 139 actions. It's an awful lot, but it's important to note that not many of these will actually come into effect. It's also important to note that despite the final report coming out, the federal government actually hasn't yet responded to many of these recommendations. So we're not 100% sure which ones it's definitely going to adopt. And we've had a couple of indications over the last few months, but I say this just to emphasize that it still might be a little bit of time whether we know which and what will actually come into place. So it's a bit of a moving fluid space at the moment as we sort of await for that federal government's response. Some of the key recommendations, we firstly have the proposed introduction of foundational supports. So foundational supports come about because it was recognised that the NDIS is a very hard scheme to be a part of, and it was, for many people with disability, the only lifeboat in the ocean. If you weren't on the NDIS, you weren't actually able to receive the supports that you needed to live the lives you wanted to live. So the foundational supports were a way in which people that weren't on the NDIS would still be able to receive some sort of help and guidance dealing with their disabilities and finding the supports that they need. So it's sort of going to exist between the NDIS as well as the healthcare, as well as education. And the idea is that we'd have people responsible for sort of suggesting where we go to if we're not on the NDIS. Even though the recommendation was for foundational supports, we still don't have a timeline when these might actually be rolled out. In reality, it will likely be sort of 2 years and more before we have a clear picture as to what they might look like. We've also, secondly, had the recommendation to introduce navigators. So navigators are essentially case managers that will exist similarly to support coordinators or local area coordinators, people that will help point you in the right direction. So these navigators are proposed to exist within the NDIA itself, so that, like I said, we will have a case manager as participants that will guide us in the right direction. Again, like foundational supports, might be a little bit of time before these are rolled out, 2 years or more. So again, a little bit of a waiting game on that one. The other interesting recommendation, and this is one that has caused a little bit of uncertainty amongst participants, and rightly so, is the recommendation that all providers should be registered. As we'll explore later on this webinar, some service types are already having a mandated registration. Whether this will exist for all providers still remains to be seen. It's a common message of today's webinar. But it's important to sort of think about how this might look like, particularly if you are employing private support workers and the like, to stay on top of this change when it might come in. Like I said, it can be incredibly uncertain as we move towards this potential space, but we'll endeavour to keep you abreast of these changes as they come into place. The final report also called for a change to home and living, with participants, able to find living arrangements more easily, and also this mooted idea of plan management being replaced. I am unsure whether this will actually be taken up by the federal government, and like with many of these recommendations, we'll just have to wait to see what actually comes into effect. We've got a link there at the bottom of the slide to the final report, what those recommendations and actions are. Definitely recommend you having a look at that. But like I said, federal government might take a little bit of time to actually implement those. As we move to the next slide, the question is, after the final report, what has actually happened? The answer is both a lot and not so much. As I said, none of those recommendations are unsure whether they're going to land or not, but there has been some movement with the government passing a bill in August to make changes to the NDIS Act. This is a very, very big deal because it gives them the ability to roll out a series of changes. Some of these come from the final report. Some of these they wanted to do prior to the report even being released. So what has the change to the Act led to practically? Well, firstly, NDIS eligibility, how it's assessed. So there's this desire to move away from, as we'll discuss in a little bit more detail, an emphasis on our disabilities and more on an emphasis on what our functional limitations of a disability are. So I, as an example, have spinal muscular atrophy. The NDIS is less interested in my formal diagnosis now, moving forward, and more around how SMA affects me day to day. So this notion that I use power to get around, I need support workers to help me day to day. And so that change to eligibility will hopefully make apologies for that, everyone. I dropped out for a moment. Hopefully I'm back and you can all hear me. I was just going through the list of what's changed so far. So it was what supports can and can't be funded, how NDIS plans are managed, and this leads to the NDIS being able to change the management type if they deem so. So for instance, anecdotally, I've had a number of friends who are NDIS participants who have had their plan managed or self-managed plans changed to agency managed. So this is a big difference in how plans can be implemented. So it's important to stay on top of this. The NDIS stresses that this is going to only be if there's any sort of mismanagement. So we'll see whether that has a practical sort of effect on other participants beyond my small circle of friends, but definitely stay on top of that one. But I need to stress, if you're doing your plan appropriately, nothing should change on that front. And the other one is requiring mandatory NDIS registration for some services, like we mentioned a little earlier. So a lot's changed. And not so much, but it's worth going into some of these in a little bit more detail, just so that we can understand how they work day to day. So like we mentioned, for assessing the eligibility, the NDIS is moving away from assessing eligibility based on diagnosis, and instead looking at need and function. So this is going to be supported by the introduction of a whole suite of different functional assessment tools, which will look at someone's overall care needs. So like I touched on, I have SMA, but the functional assessment tools that are going to be introduced will look at my care needs with regards to hydrotherapy, support work, and all those things that I need to live an independent life. The important thing to stress with this, and why I wanted to go into this in a little bit more detail, is that the NDIS proposes that those who aren't eligible for the NDIS, that don't meet that assessment eligibility, that they'll be supported by those foundational supports. So again, we're unsure when this will actually take place and come into effect, but it's, I suppose, the government's emphasis on having the NDIS as not the only lifeboat in the ocean. That's sort of the jargon it uses as it tries to support more people that aren't actually NDIS participants themselves. So if you've got any experiences with assessment, please pop them into the chat. We'd love to collate and share those stories with as many people as possible. I'll certainly do so on our blog, but that assessment is one of the key changes stemming from the final report of the review. We've then got the NDIS's new funded supports list. So this is the government's efforts to clarify what we can use our NDIS funding on. What we can use our funding on is the list as appears on your screen now. So most of the things that the majority of us use our funds towards don't actually change. So support work is still a fundable item, cleaning, gardening, housing, as well as sort of allied health services, and generally those things that are related to our disabilities. So as I'm sure some of us are aware, the NDIS has often flagged this notion of reasonable and necessary. So it's something that relates to our disability, something that represents value for money, and something that has a long-term benefit on our function. So by coming up with this list, the NDIS is trying to really clarify what is reasonable and necessary, and it's worth going through and seeing that indeed the things that you need day to day from the NDIS are on this list. But just as importantly, if there are any changes, there's going to be a transition period of up to 12 months. So a lot of time to come to grips with some of these changes. So for instance, if you are using your funds on something that might not be on this list that you have previously with no worries, the NDIS isn't going to get angry with you because it recognises that these changes are going to take a while to implement. We're probably seen in the media this list more than what we can spend our funding on, and that's what we can't spend our funding on. So we've probably seen the media say that things such as cuddle therapy and other things are no longer funded. Each of these things sort of relate to day-to-day living costs. So if we go back to that reasonable and necessary criteria, it's things that don't relate to our disabilities. So groceries and those sorts of things. There was meant to be a consultation for this list. There was a consultation, but it was very, very short. It only transpired for about a month to 2 months. But if there, like I said, are things that you're concerned about, there is a transition period of up to 12 months for us to come to grips with this. But this list is integral going forward to ensure that we're using NDIS funds in the right and appropriate way. The other thing that we touched on very, very quickly earlier on is the notion of the NDIS having more power to change funding management types. So its concern publicly within the media is that a number of people were being exploited by support workers, by service providers, and that they needed to, in those instances, move someone's plan management type to agency managed. So by moving it to agency managed, it was ensuring that people only used NDIS registered providers. This poses a challenge to many of us. So I, for instance, in plan managed, I love the choice and control of being able to choose the providers that I like. So I, for instance, have a cleaner that comes in that isn't NDIS registered. I love the fact that I can do that. It's nice and quick and easy. So it's a balancing act between having that choice and control and ensuring that other participants aren't exploited. Like I touched on, if we're doing the right thing, we shouldn't see a change practically in our day-to-day management of our NDIS plans. The other power that the NDIS has, for instance, is if a support worker has been banned by an approved quality auditor, we can't use them either, even if we're self-managed. So it's trying to determine in a little bit more detail if there's any issues with support workers who we can and can't access. I just seen a comment there from Bruce who say that you're self-managed. You said you're plan-managed. I am plan-managed. Yes. Speaking generally, self and plan-managed, there's similar abilities within the NDIS to use non-registered or unregistered providers. So the notion that the NDIA can move someone from plan-managed or self-managed to agency-managed. Thanks for prompting that clarification, Bruce. And this conversation around support workers and who we can and can't use goes to this broader conversation around mandatory NDIS registrations. So the NDIS has basically proposed registration enrollment for service providers and sole traders down the track, but this isn't yet confirmed. The difficulty with registering all providers is that it's quite a long and cumbersome process for providers to do, particularly if they're sole traders. So what the NDIS is looking at is whether for those sole traders, those that don't necessarily need a full registration, going through an enrollment process instead. So this might be as simple as a support worker, a private support worker, providing their ABN and a small amount of details to the NDIS, and that will technically enroll them. Like we said, this isn't yet confirmed, but it's probably the biggest change, potential change, that causes the most angst amongst our community. What we have seen and what is confirmed is platform providers, for instance, HireUp and Mabel, support coordinators, and also supported independent living or civil providers being mandated to start the registration process. So these particular service types indeed are facing mandatory NDIS registration, but much is the case with the NDIS funded supports list. There will be a transition process that we'll all undergo. It's not sort of the NDIS saying you must do this now. There'll be a little bit of time and a gradual phased-in introduction for these particular services. So the requirements for registration, again, pointing towards, this emphasis on us being more safely supported, is upholding and demonstrating compliance with the Code of Conduct and NDIS practice standards, providers having an in-house complaints management and resolution system, having an in-house incident management system, and also fulfilling worker screening requirements. So for current unregistered providers, they don't face these requirements, but this is what it would look like for providers should mandatory NDIS registration come into place. If it is sort of a balance between registration and this enrollment, it probably won't be as in-depth as this, but certainly if you do access platform providers, support coordinators, or civil providers, begin to ask the questions how this might change their business going forwards. Stay ahead of the changes before they actually take place. It will put you in the best stead going forwards. That's the whirlwind tour of what's currently changed. The question then is what's coming up next? So like I mentioned, we are unsure, everyone in the disability sector, as to when these changes will be implemented and if they will be implemented. But we are seeing that the NDIS flagging currently, as we might have all seen in the media, that music and art therapy will only be available as a capacity building item if it has demonstrated therapeutic value. So the current capacity building item is $193. What they're looking at doing is, if there's no what it calls demonstrated therapeutic value, participants will only be able to charge $68 per hour. This is the first of a few small changes we're likely to see in this space. And it's going to be interesting to see whether the pushback we're seeing from music and art therapy providers might change the government's decision on this. But like I said, the first of a few changes that are coming up. Important to note that more will be revealed in the coming months if more service providers do indeed need to register under the NDIS. It will be particularly interesting when it comes to support work, because it is a service type that has a number of unregistered workers. Unregistered, I mean not actually under the NDIS Commission registered with them. What enrolment will look like for these support workers, and whether, if there is some sort of enrolment registration, they might need to investigate doing their Cert 3 or Cert 4 in disability support work. So lots of changes, lots to unpack. And as we go forwards, we want to do all that we can to ensure that we can help you unravel these complexities and these changes. So just very quickly before we get to the questions, we just want to stress that if you are looking for providers, it's completely free to search our directory at Clickability. You can go and find providers who are rated and reviewed. And this, for us, is why we set up Clickability. We believe that ratings or reviews are the best form of qualification that providers can have. It's word of mouth, people that are actually using those services, reviewing those services. If you are wanting a little bit more assistance, feel free to submit a service request. You can ask us basically to find you your perfect provider by providing a small amount of information, and then we'll go find you up to 3 providers that suit. But like I touched on, reviews are the name of the game. So feel free to jump online, share your feedback to help others make informed decisions. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays into the registration and enrollment of service providers going forwards. We'll now turn to Q&A. If there are any questions, Stuart has very kindly been moderating this chat as we've gone. We've got a couple of questions I believe that have come through prior to today's webinar. But what do we have, Stuart?
All right. Yeah. So just before I start with some of these questions, we've also just thrown up another poll as well. If you're willing to travel further for a better provider experience. So jump over to the polls tab to cast your vote there. And we've had 2 questions in the Q&A and some private questions that have come through as well. Harry's asked, is there a difference between navigators, case managers, and local area coordinators?
Great question. So at the moment, we have support coordinators and local area coordinators existing side by side. They are de facto case managers. Case managers is sort of a colloquial term that I use to describe anyone that sort of supports us in managing our NDIS plans. That can be support coordination or local area coordinators. So what the NDIS is proposing is with navigators is that support coordinators and LACs actually become folded back into the NDIA and become navigators. need to stress that this is only a proposal, only a recommendation, and it will be a lot of time before we might see support coordinators and LACs become that term navigators. It'll be interesting to see, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years. But again, rest assured that it'll be time for us to come to grips with those changes should they take place.
Perfect. We've got one more question. I've got a few more questions, but there's another question from Bruce. Will all carers and providers have to register as an NDIS provider? I'm self-managed to save money using non-NDIS service providers.
It's a great question, Bruce. I'm plan managed, but a number of my workers also charge under the price arrangements and price limits, which means that I get more return from my plan so that I can do more. So I can completely understand why you as well want to go down that self-management path. The interesting thing about this is the question around enrollment that I mentioned earlier. So if someone wants to work in the NDIS space in the disability sector, but they don't necessarily provide a service that is overly complex or risky, such as cleaning, gardening, selling consumables, or those sorts of things, the enrollment will basically mean that those people just very quickly enter their details to the NDIA. So it might be their ABN or those sorts of things, just so that the NDIS can know who exactly is working in the sector. So if it does do this, and a lot of water has to pass under the bridge before we see enrollment actually enforced, should it even become enforced, it shouldn't be an overly complex thing, because the NDIS knows that choice and control is so important to us, and we shouldn't be disadvantaged by wanting to employ workers who charge under those price limits so that we can get the very most out of our plan. So enrollment might happen, might not happen. If it does, it won't be for at least sort of 2 to 3 years. And should it happen, would mean that those workers that you're using, that I'm using, won't have to go through too bureaucratic a process to continue working with us. Hopefully that answered the question. We're still unpacking all of this because it's so uncertain, but it will be a while before enrollment will take place. Different to registration, so it's not as bureaucratic, but it will be a while before it takes place, even if it does.
Can everyone hear it? Yep. Perfect. Well, we've had a few private chat questions come through as well. We might not get time for all of them, but we'll start with, there's one in regards to music and art therapy. How quickly do you think these changes will come into effect?
So the NDIS is saying that anyone that currently has music and art therapy in their plans as a capacity building line item can continue using music and art therapy at that rate of $193. You will, at the end of your plan, have to go through this notion of proving or evidencing demonstrated therapeutic value. So that will be reports from OTs, those type of professionals. OTs can do what we call functional capacity assessments, which are gold when it comes to evidencing what you need from the NDIS. Getting an OT or someone like that to evidence that you are getting genuine therapeutic value will mean that you continue to get it funded at that $193. The thing to stress, though, is that if you can't get it at that rate, that capacity building line item rate, you can still use music and art therapy. It would just be at a reduced rate of, I think it's $68. So you'll just need to talk to those music and art therapists, tell them that you aren't funded for that capacity line item, and they'll just invoice you at that lower amount. So you can definitely still use them. If it's in your plan, you can keep using capacity line items, which is really important. But yeah, it is going to be interesting once we get to those end of plan reassessments, the type of evidence that we need to prove that we want it at that therapeutic value rate of $193.
Perfect. And I think we'll have time for one more question, but if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to leave them in the chat, and we'll try and get back to them after the webinar. The last question from Samantha. I think it's been stated that travel and transport was not to be covered. What does this mean for people who are totally dependent on others to access the community?
Yeah, what a great question. So if we go back to, as I jump back through our slides, it's that funded list of NDIS supports. Some transport items are still funded. So, for instance, if they're still disability related, so if we can't drive ourselves, thanks for your patience, everyone, as I click through, we can still be funded through assistance with travel or transport arrangements. So as the best example I could give, myself as a wheelchair user, I'm unable to sort of drive my own vehicle, get myself from place to place. I will still get funding through the NDIS to get sort of disability support workers to come and help me drive either my own vehicle, or I can hire a vehicle through my capital supports, a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and have them drive that. So as we can see, the funded NDIS supports list, it explicitly states that assistance with travel or transport arrangements is still able to be funded. Holidays is an interesting one. It's often been an interesting one. I've had friends that have had holidays funded. I've had friends that haven't had holidays funded. The concern is around that sort of short-term accommodation, that respite, that old jargon line item that we used to hear. So the move is with the NDIS towards funding support workers to take us on trips, to take us on holidays, so that we can still do those things. But they're not going to continue paying, as far as I can gauge, for those sort of everyday expenses, such as paying for the accommodation or that sort of thing. There's a lot of conversation around this at the moment. So it's not yet locked in stone. But to recap my long-winded answer, assistance with travel or transport arrangements definitely still funded. Holidays, it's going to be interesting to see what happens because there's still a lot of confusion. You still will be able to use your funding towards support workers on those holidays, but we might see an inability to use funds towards the actual accommodation costs and those sorts of things. I think, is that the last question, Stuart? Anything further?
Yeah, I think just in the efforts of everyone's time, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll share the deck with everyone. So we'll email you a copy of all these slides so you've got them. We'll also try and put in the files tab of the webinar, but we haven't been able to get that to work. But yeah, that's pretty much it from our end. And any other questions that anyone has, feel free to email hello@clickability.com.au, and we'll get back to them with a response to anyone's questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Stuart. I will just, final takeaway message. We know at Clickability how daunting and scary these changes might be. I think what we've seen more than anything is the power of community. So as we talk together through these changes, clarify what they mean for us, we still have the ability to talk to the NDIS and advocate for our needs. So we're all our own best advocates, so continue to do that and reach out to Clickability for us to sort of foster that community so that we can do it together, because it's a lonely road to do it yourself. So we're here to support however we can.
Perfect. And yeah, if you joined late and you wanted to catch the beginning, we'll share this recording via email in the next 24 hours, and feel free to share that with any friends that you have that might want to learn some of this NDIS content that we've put together.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your Christmas.
See you guys.